welcome to John Jay, and to all of our students, and there's so many of you here. This is a very exciting evening. Tonight's event is one in a series being held at the college this semester on the topic of conflicting concepts of justice in the 1970s. 3 years ago, we sponsored a series on the 1950s, and guess what, last year, the 1960s. These semester-long considerations of important decades in American history were the brainchild of visiting Professor Michael Meeropol, and we're so thrilled that he's on our faculty, and have been organized in collaboration with the Interdisciplinary Studies Program, or I should say department. As is appropriate for a college that educates for justice, the decades have been examined through the twin lenses of justice and injustice. That has been their focus. This evening, I want to thank Sarah Tornay of the Jewish Association for Services for the Aged for the association's co-sponsorship of tonight's lecture. And I also want to thank Professor Michael Meeropol, Professor Jerry Markowitz, the Interdisciplinary Studies Chairperson Amy Green, who's here somewhere, and Deputy Chair Richard Haw for their support of tonight's event, and of all 3 years of remarkable programs that have featured some exciting and distinguished guests, among them Tony Kushner and Peter Yarrow of Peter, Paul, and Mary fame. Those of you too young to remember Peter, Paul, and Mary, it's okay, I do. So, our guest lecturer this evening is similarly illustrious, Professor Noam Chomsky. Professor Chomsky spoke, yes, go ahead, you can applaud him again, why not? Professor Chomsky spoke during our 1950s series, and it's my great pleasure and honor to welcome him back to John Jay this evening. You're a part of the family now. One more visit and we're going to literally adopt you. Well, I don't have to tell this crowd that Noam Chomsky is the foremost linguist in the world, a philosopher, a cognitive scientist, a logician, an historian, a political critic, and an activist. He is an intellectual rock star, and that's why you all wanted your pictures taken with him, right? It's really quite a thrill. He's also a professor, an institute professor and professor emeritus in the Department of Linguistics and Philosophy at MIT. A scientist through and through, Professor Chomsky's scientific approach first revealed itself in his path-breaking work as a linguist, beginning with syntactic structures in 1957 and continuing with current issues in linguistic theory, semantics in generative grammar, and knowledge of language. In the early 1960s, he determined to apply his scientific principles and his keen moral sense to the political struggles around the US war against the people of Indochina. Beginning with the publication of an article in the New York Review of Books, The Responsibility of Intellectuals, A Call to Action, if ever there was one, published in 1967, he has remained steadfast in his judgment that when political and intellectual leaders in the United States criticize other governments, the same logic has to apply to our own government. We have to live by the same standards we impose on other countries. It would take too long to list all his books. I'm told there are over 100 of them. This is a busy man. But I want to mention a few. Peace in the Middle East, 1964, and of course we're still struggling. Sorry, it's 1974? Okay, that was your typo, Michael. I believe, anyway. Probably mine. American Power and the New Mandarins, 1969. Profit Over People, 1998. Rogue States, 2000. And 9/11 in 2002. His productivity, both as a scholar and as a public intellectual, sets a high standard indeed for the rest of us. He is internationally recognized as one of the most critically engaged public intellectuals alive today. His writings have literally influenced millions. At age 78, you don't mind my revealing? He's, oh, good, excellent. that's a good area in which to make a numerical error. He still travels the world speaking truth to power, and he is here tonight to do that, I hope. After close to 60 years of intellectual work and 50 years of political activism, he continues to be an unapologetic critic of both American foreign policy and its ambitions for geopolitical hegemony, and of the neoliberal turn of global capitalism, which he identifies in terms of class warfare waged from above against the needs and interests of the great majority. Chomsky is also an incisive critic of the ideological role of the mainstream corporate mass media, which he maintains manufactures consent toward the desirability of the American system of political economy and the political powers supportive of it. Tonight, Professor Chomsky will speak about the conflict that began his involvement in politics, the US war against the people of Indochina, in particular, Vietnam. The title of his talk is in the form of a question: the end of the Vietnam War and the collapse of empire? Please join me in welcoming Professor Noam Chomsky.
Well, the question mark at the end of the title is significant. The Vietnam War technically ended in 1975, so right in the middle of the decade you're concerned with. And it's commonly assumed that the war ended then, and that the U.S. defeat in Vietnam was initiated the decline or maybe collapse of the American empire. There are a couple of things wrong with those assumptions. One is that the war, of course, didn't end. It ended for us. But take a walk through the Saigon hospital today, and you'll see that the war didn't end. All you have to do is look at the rows of deformed, hideously deformed fetuses that are still appearing as a result of the 10 years of chemical warfare that John F. Kennedy started in 1961, agent using one of the most carcinogenic elements known, dioxin, and the effects are now several generations down because it has genetic effects. And that's only one thing. You can walk through regions which were turned into moonscapes, and there's many other effects. So for the victims, the wars don't end. They may end for the outside aggressor, but not for the victims. The other thing is that second reason for the question is, I think it's interesting that it's called an American defeat. What I think actually happened is, and I'll talk about it, is that the United States did not achieve its maximal aims. So it didn't turn Vietnam into a paradise like Haiti or Guatemala. But it did achieve its major aims, and I'll talk about those. And we know a lot about the major aims. One good thing about this country is that it's a very free and open country by comparative standards. We have a huge record of internal documents. Fortunately, nobody looks at them. So it's only there if you want to know what's going on. But you're not going to read about it in the newspapers or even most scholarship. So I think it's a partial victory, substantial victory. As far as the collapse of American empire is concerned, I think there's some questions about that too. That is a major topic of contemporary discussion in political and international affairs circles. It's usually, there's a more polite term for it than American empire. It's called American decline. Empire is a word we use for others, not for ourselves. And it really is a major topic. So, for example, if you take the main establishment journal, Foreign Affairs, Journal of the Council on Foreign Relations, at the year-end issue in 2011, December 2011, take a look at the front cover of it, in big bold letters. It says, "Is America over? Are we done for?" And the lead article there says, well, we've got to retrench. We've spent so much money and effort in our humanitarian efforts all over the world that it's just beyond what we can manage, so we better pull back. You go back the following year, 2012, December 2012, there's the opposite end of the spectrum, an article responding to it, which suggests that we can't really retrench. The world needs us too much. We'd better continue with our benevolent efforts to do good everywhere. That's the range of discussion. And then there's a debate about all kind of other side stories about whether China is going to be the next hegemonic power and so on. I don't agree with most of that either. But whatever one thinks about it, whatever happened in Vietnam did not initiate the decline, which is real. I mean, power is getting more diversified in the world, so unfortunately, relatively speaking, American power is less than it was. But that's been going on since 1945. The U.S. power peaked in 1945, and not only in the history of the United States, in the history of the world. There's never been a power in the history of the world that was as powerful as the U.S. was in 1945. It had literally half the world's wealth. The Second World War was very beneficial to the American economy. Industrial production practically quadrupled. The country itself, of course, wasn't hit. Competitors were seriously weakened or completely destroyed. And the U.S. literally had half the world's wealth, a position of overwhelming security, controlled the whole hemisphere, both oceans, the opposite sides of both oceans. And planners during the Second World War knew it very well, Roosevelt's planners. And they laid out plans for how to run the post-war world. And the plans were pretty much implemented in the following years. They were not unrealistic. The basic plans were that the U.S. should dominate a global system, which would include automatically the Western Hemisphere. That's our back pocket. So yes, we, of course, controlled the Western Hemisphere. It was called our little region over here, which has never bothered anyone. That's Secretary of War Henry Stimson. Part of the post-World War II settlement was there wouldn't be any regional systems, but he said, well, there's got to be one, our little system over here, the Western Hemisphere. So that, of course, we're going to replace the British Empire. The British Empire had been the dominant power for centuries, so we'll take over the British Empire, and in fact, they'll now be our client. The British were aware of it. They didn't like it. If you read the Foreign Office reports, they're pretty upset about it, but there's nothing they could do. So the U.S. was going to take over the British Empire, which of course in particular meant the Middle East energy supplies. That was a crucial part of it. The U.S. would take over the entire Far East. Other countries were excluded from the peace settlement over the East. There was, of course, a peace treaty, San Francisco Peace Treaty in 1951, a peace treaty with Japan. But the war was defined, the Pacific War was defined as beginning from 1941. That's rather crucial because it actually began 10 years earlier. It's just that for the preceding 10 years, it was Asians who got massacred. So therefore, that didn't count. So the war began with Pearl Harbor, and Japanese crimes were limited to anything that happened after that. Other Asian countries were infuriated by this, and most of them, the ones who had any degree of independence, just refused to attend the peace conference. So, for example, India didn't attend. Others didn't attend. The only ones who attended were basically colonies. The Philippines, I think Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, attended, but the major countries just wouldn't come. And so nobody was going to have a share in running Japan or the Far East. So we take over the Western Hemisphere, the Far East, former British Empire, which of course was huge, and as much of Eurasia as was possible, crucially the commercial and industrial center of Eurasia, Western Europe, and as much more as possible. That was the post-war planning. And as I say, it wasn't unrealistic. Detailed plans were laid as to how to carry it out and largely implemented. But it started declining right away. The first major decline was in 1949, just 4 years later, when China declared independence. Now that event has a very interesting description in U.S. discourse. It's called the loss of China. And a big issue in the United States is who was responsible for the loss of China. A lot of recriminations, McCarthyism comes out of that, and so on. And the phrase itself is never challenged, which is kind of interesting. So, for example, I can't lose your computer, right? I can lose my computer. I can't lose your computer. And the tacit assumption is, well, of course we own China, like we own everything. And therefore, if China becomes independent, it's the loss of China. And that's a huge issue since from 1949 until today, in fact. There was concern right at the time. By the late 40s, it was pretty clear that it was going to be pretty hard to hold on to our possession, China. And there was concern that it might be followed by the loss of Indochina. That's serious. The U.S. was supporting France in its effort to reconquer its former colony, and not out of any illusions. U.S. intelligence and State Department understood very well that Ho Chi Minh, leader of the Vietnamese nationalist movement, was the only person of any influence and popular support in Indonesia, in Indochina, and that was a kind of a problem because they recognized that any solution that doesn't include him and the Viet Minh, the resistance forces against the Japanese, is not going to work very well. But nevertheless, we had to prevent the loss of Indochina. And there were good reasons for that. They were described, the planning was quite sophisticated. It's worth reading the documents. The policy planning staff of the State Department was the main planning agency that was headed by George Kennan, who's regarded sort of as a dove. With regard to, they assigned every region of the world a function that they were supposed to carry out within the world system. There was one region that the U.S. wasn't much interested in, Africa. Later they were, but not then. So Kennan's decision was to hand Africa over to the Europeans to exploit, that's his word, so that Europe could exploit Africa for its reconstruction. You can imagine a different relation between Europe and Africa, considering a couple hundred years of history, but that never crossed anyone's mind. And if you look at the scholarship on the topic, it never crosses anyone else's mind. So that's Africa. We hand it to Europe to exploit. Southeast Asia was, I'll read, was to fulfill its major function as a source of raw materials for Japan and Western Europe. That's Southeast Asia. And then comes planning about Indochina. This is mostly quoting. If Indochina is lost, they said, Southeast Asia will topple like a row of dominoes. The Domino Theory is actually much earlier, but it was resuscitated in this context. I should say that the Domino Theory is often ridiculed when the dominoes don't fall, but the reason they don't fall is overlooked. They don't fall because the U.S. propped them up with violence, so therefore they didn't fall. But the Domino Theory is, although it's ridiculed, it's never questioned. It's over and over, right through the internal record up till the present, this deep concern about the Domino Theory. And the reason is it just makes sense. It's a very rational theory. What's going to make the dominoes fall? Well, it was understood that it wouldn't be conquest like George Kennan or Dean Acheson didn't think that Ho Chi Minh was going to get into a canoe and conquer Indonesia or Japan or anything like that. Or when it was resuscitated by Henry Kissinger for Allende's Chile, he described another familiar term that was used, Kissinger reused it, was that Allende's Chile was a virus that might spread infection all over, all the way to southern Europe. Now, he didn't think that Chilean armies were going to land in Rome. May have had some weird ideas, but not that. And in fact, in general, it's never military conquest that's considered. The mechanism for the dominoes to a fall is the demonstration effect, what's sometimes called the threat of a good example. So if some poor country, which has suffered miserably, say, under colonialism, finds a way towards successful independent development, it's going to appeal to others. They might try to do the same thing, and the dominoes will start falling. The virus will spread infection, and pretty soon the whole system starts to erode. Very rational theory, never questioned. In Southeast Asia, one domino of considerable importance was Indonesia. Vietnam, Indochina, they didn't care much about. There was a lot of talk by Eisenhower and others about its resources, but that was just an effort to build up some popular support for the war. It has some resources, but not that much. Indonesia is different, has very rich resources. And Kennan, top planner, was aware of it. Here's his formulation in 1948. The problem of Indonesia is the most crucial issue of the moment and our struggle with the Kremlin. The Kremlin wasn't within thousands of miles of Indonesia, but that's the mantra. Whatever we're doing, up till 1989, it's to defend ourselves from Russian aggression. So Indonesia in 1948 was the most crucial moment in our struggle with the Kremlin, and the reason is that Indonesia is the anchor in a chain of islands stretching from Hokkaido to Sumatra, which we should develop as a politico-economic counterforce to communism and a base area for possible military action beyond. Communist Indonesia, which would be indigenous, of course, would be an infection that would sweep westward through all of South Asia, reaching the Middle East, threatening Europe. So if Indonesia is affected by the disease coming from Vietnam, successful independent development, we might lose everything all the way to Europe. The tone in the documents is very much like the business literature, completely paranoid. It's remarkably paranoid. If you lose anything, you've lost everything. It's like a 3-year-old who somebody takes away a toy, the world's coming to an end. And that's what it's like to be super powerful. You see it in the business literature all the time, and it runs right through the planning record. So if the virus from Indochina spreads to Indonesia, pretty soon we'll lose Europe. As I said, Kissinger uses it later for Allende, and it's common. Cuba was the same. In the case of Cuba, as soon as it got independence in 1959, almost immediately, talk starts about the virus. And it was explained quite straightforwardly. So Arthur Schlesinger, historian, who was Kennedy's advisor and Latin American specialist, before Kennedy came into office, Kennedy had a task force to look at Latin America. Kissinger ran it, and he reported back that the problem with Cuba is what he called the Castro idea of taking matters into your own hands, which will appeal to other countries in the region that are subject to the same oppression and colonial repression and atrocities, and maybe they'll try to take matters into their own hands. And then we're in trouble because the system starts to collapse right in our backyard. Pretty soon after that, of course, it was all blamed on the Russians. The Not always. A couple of years later, the State Department pointed out that the problem with Cuba is what it called its successful defiance of U.S. policies going back to the Monroe Doctrine in 1823. No Russians, we're supposed to run the hemisphere, and they're defying us, and they're getting away with it. That's intolerable. Talking to Michael before, the best way of thinking about international affairs is like the mafia. It's very much like the mafia. I mean, if the Godfather doesn't get paid by, say, protection money by some small storekeeper, maybe he wouldn't even notice the money. It's pennies. But you can't let him get away with it. And you don't just send the goons in to get the money. You send them in to beat them to a pulp or kill them, so others get the idea that there's no successful defiance allowed in this system. That's quite important. And that's how international affairs work. It's probably one of the very few principles of international relations theory that works. Of course, you never read it anywhere because it works too well. But that's approximately what goes on. So how does the virus affect others? Independent development is a model. And that's actually one of the major themes of post-war history. Cold War history runs right through all the way. Well, the concern about Indochina, by the late 40s, it really reached colossal proportions. So there was concern about the Kremlin-inspired drive to rule the world, reaching to Southeast Asia. National Security Council Memorandum 48 in 1949 said, it is now clear that Southeast Asia is the target of a coordinated offensive directed by the Kremlin. And unless we stop it, the effects will be felt from Australia to the Middle East. The loss of Indochina would undoubtedly lead to the loss of Southeast Asia and hence most of the world by the mechanisms I've just described. Another phrase that's commonly used is that the rot will spread. The rot will spread to Thailand, Philippines, Indonesia, and finally Japan. Japan was sometimes called the super domino. That's the one that really matters. It's the industrial, technological heartland of Asia. And what would happen would be that if we lose Southeast Asia to independent nationalism, then Japan will that's its resource area, market area. We've already lost China. And Japan will be compelled to accommodate, the term that's used, to the independent Asian system and move to become its industrial, technological center because it's much more advanced. And that would mean, in effect, that Japan would reconstruct what it was trying to create during the Second World War. It's called a co-prosperity sphere, with Japan at the center and everything else part of the system. And that would mean that the United States had lost the Second World War in the Pacific. And in 1949, they were not willing to lose the Second World War. That was not a trivial matter. And that was the primary concern. A couple of years later, John F. Kennedy appears. He's a senator at the time. He was one of the most extreme of anyone. He said, this is 1956, he described Vietnam as the cornerstone of the free world in Southeast Asia, the keystone in the arch, the finger in the dike. Burma, Thailand, India, Japan, the Philippines are threatened if the red tide of communism overflowed into Vietnam. That's an interesting image, too. Where's it overflowing from? Well, of course, the Kremlin, but reality is a little different. So if it overflows into Vietnam, we're going to lose all of that stuff. And moreover, the independence of free Vietnam is crucial to the free world in fields other than military. Its political liberty is an inspiration to those seeking to obtain or maintain their liberty in all parts of Asia, indeed the world. What is this paragon of political liberty that he's talking about? Kind of a neo-fascist state installed by the United States, very much like Latin American dictatorships, so brutal. It was installed in violation of the Geneva Accords, which were supposed to settle the problem, but the U.S. wasn't having that. So they installed a client state which was so vicious and brutal that within the next 5 or 6 years, it probably killed 70 or 80,000 people. And the brutality inspired resistance, elicited resistance. The resistance grew beyond what the client state could handle. So in 1961, Kennedy had to invade directly. That's when the U.S. invaded South Vietnam, 1961. It's not called that, of course. We'd call it that if anyone else did it. But what happened was that the resistance had gotten out of control. Essentially no North Vietnamese at the time. Putting aside the question whether North Vietnamese have a right to be in Vietnam, let's say they didn't, because we own it after all. But the South Vietnamese resistance was much too strong. Government couldn't control it. Kennedy, 1961, authorized the U.S. Air Force to start bombing South Vietnam, authorized napalm, authorized chemical warfare to destroy crops, incidentally, destroy food crops. It was rather crucial. Well, what happens to the population? No big problem. We drive them into what were called strategic hamlets, which are concentration camps where they're surrounded by barbed wire to protect them from the guerrillas, which the U.S. government knew perfectly well they were people they were supporting. So we drive them away. We kill the crops everywhere else. Meanwhile, to this day, killing infants in South Vietnam. But it's for the benefit of the free world, the political liberty that's an inspiration to those seeking to obtain and maintain their liberty. That's the left of American politics. I'm not talking about the right wing, which is more extreme. There's a lot of illusions about Kennedy, kind of Camelot illusions. He's depicted on the left too as some kind of a dove, who was maybe misled by his advisors or something. It kind of reminds me of Truman's attitude towards Stalin. Truman really admired Stalin. As late as 1948, Truman was saying that Stalin's really a good guy, old Joe as he called him. He's misled by the Politburo, but he's really a good guy. I can get along with him fine. His advisors had to shut him up by 1948. But incidentally, old Joe is quite different from Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong, you know who that was. He was a total monster, but old Joe was a nice guy. And the attitude of the left towards Kennedy is a little bit like that, misled by his advisors. Not a particle of evidence for it. He was at the hawkish end of his administration right until the assassination on issue after issue, not just in Vietnam. He flatly refused any effort to get out of Vietnam unless it was after victory. He knew the war was unpopular, everyone did, so yes, after victory, maybe if we got a client state established, we can get out. Same incidentally in Cuba. So after the Bay of Pigs invasion, when that failed, there was also hysteria in Washington. Kennedy launched a major terrorist war, one of the main terrorist wars, maybe the main one of the modern period, to bring the terrors of the earth to Cuba, Arthur Schlesinger's phrase. It was run by his brother, Robert Kennedy, and it was his top priority was to bring the terrors of the earth to Cuba. And it was no joke, very serious terrorist war. The first book reviewing the effect on Cubans' oral history just appeared by a Canadian researcher, Keith Belender. You'll be sure it's not going to be reviewed in the United States. But that's the first one. Major war. Kennedy had to call it off when the missile crisis came. That practically blew up the world. As soon as the missile crisis was over, he reintroduced it. And the terror continued. In fact, it was continuing. There was a terrorist act planned right on the day of his assassination. So these are all total illusions. I mean, if Kennedy had wanted to get out of Vietnam, nothing easier. A couple of months before his assassination, U.S. intelligence discovered that the U.S. client, President Diem, and his brother were making a deal, were negotiating with the North to try to end the conflict by some sort of negotiated settlement. So if you want to get out, that's perfect. They were going to make a negotiated settlement, ask the U.S. to leave. So easy, no problem. Well, what Kennedy did was have him eliminated. He was killed, actually, both him and his brother, and put in a military coup, put in a more hawkish general who keep going until victory. And that's the way it went till the end. So these are illusions. Incidentally, the hysterical tone extended to China, too. I don't have time to talk about it. There's a very good book on it. Jim Peck, good China historian, has a book called Washington's China, which just runs through the internal documents from the loss of China up until the time when the documents run dry around the late 60s. And they're very interesting. There's a bottom line. China's the worst criminal in the world. The premises that lead to it keep changing. So in the early years, it's the worst thing in the world because it's a Soviet puppet. A couple of years later, it was practically a war with the Russians. So it's the worst place in the world because it's independent of the Russians. And it's carrying out wars of national liberation in opposition to the moderate Russians, and so on. So the arguments are interesting. Same conclusion always. Assumptions keep changing, but the conclusion is what you need, like Kennan's Kremlin dominated conspiracy to overthrow Indochina and capture the rest of the world. Well, it's kind of interesting. If you take a look at the Pentagon Papers, it's 25 years of intelligence documents are in there. It's an unusual collection of documents, kind of you get sometimes from a country when you conquer it and capture its archives. These are usually not things that are released. And there's some interesting things there. One of the most interesting things in the Pentagon Papers is that in this entire 25 years, there is one staff paper, never even submitted, which raises the question whether Hanoi and China are following their own national objectives or whether they're just clients of somebody, the Russians, the Chinese, whatever it may be. Even in the intelligence community, which is paid sort of to get the facts straight, not just to produce propaganda, you couldn't ask the question. The religion is so profound, so deeply rooted, that the question can't even be asked. It's a pretty remarkable fact about American culture, which shows up here. Incidentally, I don't think this is ever discussed in the scholarly literature on Vietnam, which is huge. Intelligence did try from the late 40s to try to find some evidence that Hanoi was being controlled by. You couldn't even ask about the National Liberation Front. They were not supposed to exist. But Hanoi, and they were pretty independent, incidentally, until they were finally crushed. But you could ask whether Hanoi was being directed by China or Russia. Had to be one or the other. Or maybe the Sino-Soviet conspiracy. There were three possibilities. It had to be one or the other. And intelligence really worked hard to try to find some evidence for it. Once they thought they had found a Russian newspaper in the Hanoi embassy in Thailand. They were all excited about that. The main thing is the longer they tried, the less they could find. They finally concluded that North Vietnam is the only place in Southeast Asia where there's no connection to the Russians or the Chinese. And then they drew the obvious conclusion. They both know that Ho Chi Minh is such a loyal subject that they don't even have to give him directions. So this proves the thesis that he's a total slave of the Sino-Soviet conspiracy. That took care of that. By the mid-60s, the war was escalated to the worst atrocity of the Second World War, post-Second World War period. There's nothing else in international affairs that comes close. The leading, the most respected historian and military historian and Vietnam expert was Bernard Fall. He was highly respected in Washington, incidentally. If you take a look at Robert McNamara's memoirs, Secretary of Defense, Fall was the only outside expert outside Washington government who's mentioned there, mentioned very favorably. In 1967, Fall wrote, "Vietnam as a cultural and historic entity is threatened with extinction, while in the South, the countryside literally dies under the blows of the largest military machine ever unleashed on an area of this size, which he feared might prevail." And it's very interesting to read McNamara's reaction to that. He quotes it, and he says, well, Fall was becoming optimistic. He was becoming optimistic that the United States would win. Before that, he wasn't sure, but now he's becoming optimistic because we've destroyed the country so totally it's going to disappear. So that was very it was cheerful news in Washington. McNamara is regarded as a dove, incidentally. This book is considered his kind of recantation, of all of this, but that's the assumption. Well, how do you deal with a virus that's spreading infection? It's straightforward. You kill the virus, you inoculate the potential victims. So you destroy the virus and you install vicious military dictatorships all around so they don't get infected. And that's the way it's done consistently. So in the case of Vietnam, Vietnam was pretty much destroyed. Couldn't totally wipe it out, but it's never going to be a model for anyone. The idea that it'll be a successful model that'll spread the virus of independence, that was finished by the early 60s, in fact. All the surrounding countries, the U.S. imposed harsh and brutal military dictatorships. Thailand, the Philippines, Indonesia, one by one. So the virus wouldn't spread. Incidentally, the same was done in the case of Cuba. Remember, Cuba was going on at the same time. The United States is a global power. It's usually doing the same thing in different parts of the world. This is ignored in commentary and scholarship by specialization. So there's some people who study Vietnam, and there's some other people who study Cuba, and there's some other people who study the Middle East, but nobody studies the United States. We don't make that mistake when we're studying Russian domination. But here this is crucial because the United States is a benign, confused actor, doesn't quite know what it's doing, makes mistakes and so on. But all the same things are happening all over the world, and it's supposed to be, it's not even noticed. But so take Cuba. Cuba was about the same time as South Vietnam. Bay of Pigs was 1961, just when Kennedy's invasion took off. And the same thing happened in the case of Cuba. They didn't quite kill the virus. In the case of Cuba, it survives. But they made it pretty sure that it's not going to be a model to anyone. Barely survives under massive terrorism, 50 years of harsh sanctions, strongly opposed by the whole world, including all of Latin America, but it doesn't make any difference. But the point is to keep it from succeeding. And the surrounding region was surrounded by dictatorships. First, this is under Kennedy, beginning with Kennedy. The first one was Brazil, the most important country. Military dictatorship was installed right after Kennedy's assassination. It was actually planned during his administration. Kind of a neo-Nazi national security state, torture, killing, murder, and so on. And then it just spread. Chile was one case. The dominoes fell. By the 1980s, reached Central America under Reagan. Sadistic atrocities, hundreds of thousands of people killed. No hope of any virus spreading from there. And Haiti is another one. Aristide was immediately crushed as soon as he took office. A hideous history. If there's time, I'd go into it. But the point is it's consistent. It's perfect, and the same was going on in the Middle East. It's consistent and rational. The same in Africa, incidentally. Lumumba, for example, he had to be killed because it might be a virus. It happens everywhere. It's very rational. It's rational imperial planning, but you're not allowed to recognize that It has to be some kind of error, or confusion, or, the problem was William Bundy didn't take a course in Vietnamese history in Yale or something like that. But in any way, in Indochina, the virus was destroyed. The surrounding countries were subjected to brutal dictatorships. The free world was saved. Meanwhile, the U.S. had to do something about Japan because we were taking away its co-prosperity sphere. And the answer was, as Kennan put it, to give Japan what he called a co-prosperity sphere. That is, to give Japan exactly what it was after, co-prosperity sphere, an empire toward the south, as Kennan called it, but under our control. So then it's okay. As long as we're in control of the whole thing, it really doesn't matter. So that was done. Same in, and it was reasonably successful. But, history kind of has its own cunning. And by now, the rest of Asia is being lost. Same in Latin America. Worked for a long time, horrible repression, atrocities, crimes. Last 10 years, Latin America has totally broken from U.S. control. It's an event of historic significance. And it's very dramatic. Just one example just showed up a couple days ago. You may have seen the Open Society Forum just published a report, interesting report on rendition. Rendition is, you know what that is? It's if you have a suspect and you don't want to be caught torturing them yourself, you send them to some state like Syria or some Libya under Gaddafi and make sure he'll get tortured there. And other countries have to participate. So the study was which countries participated in the U.S. rendition program, global torture program. Well, it turns out there's a map. If you take a look at the map, it's every area of the world, most of Europe, the Middle East, of course, because a lot of the torture was going on there, North Africa, Asia. One region of the world is missing. Nothing in Latin America, which is pretty remarkable, because Latin America was the backyard. They did what we said. Furthermore, Latin America was the torture center of the world from Kennedy up to this millennium, as the U.S. installed these torture states. But they're missing. The last 10 years, they're free of it. Much more evidence. Well, let's go back to the post-war period in Vietnam. There's a split between what are called hawks and doves. The hawks say it was a noble cause. If we tried harder, we could have won. We were stabbed in the back. The doves say it was a noble cause, but it was just too costly for us. So, for example, Anthony Lewis, way at the extreme left of critical commentary in the media, says the U.S. effort began under Kennedy with benign efforts to do good, but by 1969 it turned out that it was a disaster. It was too costly for us. We couldn't bring democracy and freedom to Vietnam at a cost acceptable to ourselves. So it was a real mistake. That's the spectrum. You get to see it with the presidents. So 1975, the war technically ended. Carter came into office, human rights president. He was asked right away, 1977, whether he thought we owe something to the Vietnamese after what happened. Remember, this is tail end of the anti-war movement. A lot of people are aware of what was going on. And Carter answered, we owe Vietnam no debt because the destruction was mutual. Okay? All I have to do is walk through Quang Ngai province, Moonscape, and walk through Atlanta, Georgia, and you can see the destruction was mutual, so we owe them no debt. That's the dovish extreme, the human rights president. Now you get to the next president, Carter, it was just a noble cause, period. I mean, you get to George Bush the first, the reasonable Bush, the one we're supposed to admire. by that time, he was willing to enter into some kind of deals with Vietnam. And he told the Vietnamese, he said, look, we're a magnanimous people. We don't hold grudges. So we'll forgive you of the atrocities you committed against us if you devote all your resources to the one moral issue that remains after the war, namely finding the bones of American pilots who you viciously shot down while they were peacefully flying over North Vietnam. That's approximately the spectrum. And it also shows up in scholarship. So there's a good journal, Diplomatic History. It's a very good scholarly journal, kind of liberal flavor. It has an article this month, just came out, on the 10 years of chemical warfare. Started in 61 under Kennedy, went on for 10 years. And it brings up some new material about how horrible it was, doesn't cite the studies of the effects on Vietnamese. That's going too far. But it's critical of it. So it's called dovish. It's critical because the Pentagon refused to recognize that it was futile. It was creating enemies faster than it was killing people. It's kind of like the drone attacks. So it's futile, and therefore it was wrong. Kind of like what Nazi generals would have said after Stalingrad. The Second Front was just stupid, should have knocked off England first. Then it would have been great. Well, that's the dovish extreme in scholarship. What about the empire? Let's say something about that. You get a very good insight into U.S. planning by looking at something which is almost completely ignored, but I urge you to look at it. One way to understand what U.S. planning has been about since the Second World War is to take a look at what happened when the great enemy disappeared, 1989. Okay, no more Russians. So what happens? Well, what happens is kind of interesting. This was the Bush #1 administration. They immediately produced a national security strategy, a new budget, and so on. It's public. You don't have to do any deep research to find it. And it's interesting. Basically, it says everything's going to go on exactly like as before, but with new pretexts, because we can't appeal to the Russians anymore. So we have to maintain a huge military system. You're not supposed to laugh, because of the technological sophistication of third world powers. Literally. If you're a well-educated intellectual, you don't laugh, and nobody laughed. So we have to maintain what they called the defense industrial base. That's a euphemism for high-tech industry. The public has to pay the costs of advanced industry. Steve Jobs and Bill Gates can make the profits, but first it has to be in the state system for decades where the creative hard work is done. So we have to keep the defense industrial base. Particularly interesting was what they said about the Middle East. The U.S. has massive intervention forces aimed at the Middle East. And it said we have to maintain these intervention forces aimed at the Middle East. Here comes an interesting phrase, where the serious problems we faced could not have been laid at the Kremlin's door. So in other words, excuse us, we've been lying to you for 60 years, but now we got to tell the truth because the Kremlin's not around. So the problems couldn't have been laid at the Kremlin door. Yeah, they're independent nationalism, which of course it always was. All that's ignored. Meanwhile, what about the empire? Go back to the title. Is the empire collapsing? It's declining. It's been declining since 1945. The world's getting more diverse. More losses are coming all along. Latin America was lost. A lot of Asia's been lost. The deep concern about the Arab Spring, particularly about the possible threat of democracy, was that the Middle East might be lost. But that's been stemmed for the time being, so maybe that won't be lost. But it is diversifying. There's no question about it. On the other hand, U.S. power is still overwhelming. And I should add, interesting topic, that in recent years, the empire has been declining because of domestic policies, which are undermining the health and undermining the society, consciously undertaken policies. That's a separate topic. So yeah, it's declining, but there is no global power that's anywhere on the horizon that's a competitor. Okay, I'll stop there. Yeah.
Hi. So I have sort of an economic question. You hear all kinds of stuff about jobs these days. I've listened to a couple of your talks on CD, where you talk about a couple things. One where you talk about the mill hands in Lowell and how they complained bitterly as they were forced into factories off the farms, and the values that they fought for in the Revolutionary War were taken away, and they felt like they were just turned into wage slaves. And in another talk, you talk about trade and world trade and how like 99% of it is just speculation and maybe only 1% is tangible goods. So given that, would you say that jobs are the solution or part of the problem?
Did you get that?
I got everything but the last
Okay.
sentence.
Did you say that jobs were the solution or part of the problem?
Well, what's the big problem in the United States is joblessness. It's by far the biggest problem in the United States, domestic problem. There's millions of people unemployed. That's destroying their lives. Stay out of the labor force too long, you're never going to get back into it. Destroying their families. Even from a narrow economic point of view, it's destroying American prosperity. They're not working, which means they're not producing things that the country badly needs. So yes, joblessness is a very serious problem. I don't know what that has to do with the other aspects of the question, but and the population knows it. So like when you ask people, what's the biggest domestic problem? Joblessness. However, there's a segment of the country which doesn't agree with that, and they happen to own and run the country. The financial institutions, overwhelmingly powerful ever since the 1970s when the economy was redesigned. And for them, they don't care about jobs. What they care, in fact, even the rest of the corporate sector doesn't care that much. They can hire people at miserable wages and horrifying conditions, and China, Vietnam, Bangladesh, wherever it may be. So the tiny corporate and financial elite don't really care about jobs. What they care about is the threat, very remote threat, but it's not zero, that ultimately there might be a certain amount of inflation. Inflation is bad for lenders. It's good for borrowers. So the banks don't like inflation. And although right now the problem is deflation, and the famous markets don't care about inflation. You can see by the way people are investing in long-term treasury securities and so on. But that's a potential problem that bothers those who Adam Smith called the masters of mankind, the guys who run the show. So therefore the focus is totally on the deficit. The sequester right now is because of the deficit. The total focus, almost total focus in Washington is the deficit. The media go along reflexively, and that's what everyone talks about. But yeah, the problem is jobs. And there are ways of overcoming it. In fact, one way, corporations have money coming out of their pockets. They don't know what to do with it. Front page article in the New York Times about it today. But they don't want to invest it. And they don't want to invest it because there's no demand. And they're not going to do it. And there's one way to create demand, and that's for the government to create it. And that means increasing the deficit. Increasing the deficit will improve the economy by creating demand, and then even better than that is stimulus spending. So that's a way to deal with the joblessness program. And in fact, it's not a particularly exotic suggestion. So the business press suggested, for example. You can read it in Business Week. It's not outlandish suggestion. Any economist who has their head screwed on understands this. The IMF is even beginning to propose it. But that won't work because the Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan Chase and those guys, they don't want it. So therefore we look at the insignificant question of the deficit, which is in fact reducing, but we've got to reduce it more because maybe someday there might be a touch of inflation. But jobs are the problem, if that's what you meant. Yes.
I'm from Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada, and I'm bringing gratitude from thousands of activists across our country. Thank you so much for your important work, and I'm very sorry about our conservative Harper government. My question is, I'm wondering if you can share your thoughts about this new Asia-Pacific pivot and the planned naval base between South Korea and the United States on Jeju Island and how that fits in. Thank you.
You got that?
Yes, I got that. As you may know, there's a new, pretty big naval base going up on Jeju Island, a small island off the coast of North Korea, but it's a South Korean island. It's over the overwhelming opposition of the population. They've been protesting it. There's been civil disobedience, arrests, and so on. But South Korean police and military are pretty tough. They go in there and smash it up on orders, really, from the U.S. The naval base has no function except to threaten China. It's aimed towards China, and everyone understands that. So that's part of the so-called pivot towards China. It's not the only case. The U.S. has a string of military bases surrounding China, many of them from way back. Like some of the main ones are in Okinawa. In Okinawa, the population is also strongly protesting it for a lot of reasons. American soldiers commit crimes, rapes and so on. And they don't like the planes flying in right into the middle of the city and stuff like that. But the Japanese government's actually, the Japanese government did have a prime minister a while back who said a couple of years ago, who said he might remove it. So he was quickly kicked out. The U.S. has plenty of clout there. So they're backing it. And it's all, you take a look at the map. China is surrounded by a string of U.S. military bases or clans. And the pivot to Asia is an attempt to expand this. So Marines are being sent to Northwest Australia, new bases being set up, and so on. And that's to counter the threat of China. And there's a threat. It's described in the strategic analysis literature. In fact, it's called a classic security dilemma. The classic security dilemma is that China and the United States each have kind of a concern of existential significance that they can't give up, and they're in conflict. What is it? It's that China wants to have influence over the waters surrounding China, not the Caribbean, waters surrounding China, which are its trade routes. It's commercial, crucial for commercial purposes and so on. They want to be able to influence those. And the U.S. doesn't want them to. These are our waters off the coast of China. So what's called freedom of the seas has to be maintained, meaning it doesn't have to be maintained in the Caribbean or off the coast of California, but it has to be maintained off the coast of China. So that's a classic security dilemma, and could lead to confrontation. We don't know. There's conflicts between Japan and China over obscure bunch of islands, which are very far from Japan. They're pretty close to Taiwan. And China and Japan both claim them. This has to do with what China calls the century of humiliation. For a century, China was, you go back to the early 18th century, China and India had about half the world's GDP, the richest, most prosperous places in the world. But it changed under imperial domination. And China had lost a lot of its, subjected to really vicious treatment, the Opium Wars, all sorts of other things. And among other things, they lost control of the region region surrounding them. I mean, Okinawa used to be a tributary of China. Yeah, but sorry, but all right, I'm talking too long.
No, I need you to talk into the
Oh, I'm
mic so
sorry.
that
I
the
should be
recording-
talking. Yeah, sorry. But so yes, there's that conflict, what Japanese call the Senkaku Islands, and these conflicts. And if you look at the Southeast Asian countries, they're not happy about China's power for very good reasons. It's quite interesting that U.S. planners knew this in the 1960s, while they were raving about China, expanding over the world. They considered what would happen. One of the options that was considered was to leave Vietnam alone, to let it be unified, and then they said it will resume its traditional hostility to China. Okay, but that wasn't considered an option. I mean, they of course understood this. It's an old hostility going back 1,000 years, and I could tell you more about it. I don't go on too long, but yes, there's a pivot to Asia, which could be serious. It's I mean, the interactions between China and the United States are so dense by now. It's not by no means clear it'll lead to a military confrontation, but it's something to keep your eyes on.
Hi, I wanted to ask you about this new bipartisan policy that both parties in the United States has in regards to the drone attacks and entering the airspace of other countries illegally to do these drone attacks and kill citizens, especially if they're American citizens, sort of like the license to kill. And if you think that there's any possibilities that there will be able to overturn this either through the Supreme Court or through public outrage, because currently there's both parties have taken it for granted that this is something that they're allowed to do.
Yeah, this is the question of
Why don't you tell?
comment on the bipartisan agreement in support of the drone attacks, which are killing innocent civilians all over the world, including American citizens. And do you think that there's any possibility, either through public outrage or the Supreme Court or some other mechanism, that we within the United States can stop this from happening? Is that a fair reproduction of the question?
Yeah. Well, the drone attacks are simply a global assassination campaign. There used to be something in Anglo-American law, which goes back to the 13th century, Magna Carta, which is called presumption of innocence. Means a person's innocent until proven guilty under due process by a jury of his peers. That's 13th century. That's in the American Constitution, 5th and 6th Amendments. That's been almost totally abandoned. That's the foundation of Anglo-American law. It's completely forgotten. You take a look at the planning for the drone attacks. It's been published. It's been made public. You can read details about it. What happens is, Obama and his national security advisor, Brennan, get together in the morning. Brennan's a former priest, so they read some passages from St. Augustine about just war. And then after that, they decide who they're going to kill today. And the criteria, they make it clear the criteria are pretty loose. I mean, if a group of men are found together somewhere, loading a truck, you can kill them because they might be terrorists. And Holder was asked, well, what about due process? He said, well, there is due process. We talk about it in the executive branch. I mean, the kings of England in the 13th century would have been delighted with this notion of due process. And it's all over. So you're not going to get anything of the Supreme Court, especially the very reactionary Supreme Court. There is bipartisan agreement. The reason is it's pretty cheap. There is some problem about harm to Americans. There's now concern that the people who, you may have read this, that the people who sit at the computers and control the drones, they're having some psychological problems. When a jet fighter goes over some village and drops bombs, it goes away, right? So they don't see what they're doing. But these guys, the drone is circling around, it bombs some place, they see pieces of bodies flying all over the place, children killed and so on, and it's hard for them. So they're having psychological problems, and there are now programs being initiated to deal with the hard psychological problems facing the guys in the computers in, Las Vegas or wherever they are. So there's some cost to the United States, but not really serious ones. It's a cheap way of killing a lot of people. Is it like the chemical warfare, futile? Maybe. It seems to be probably creating potential terrorists faster than it's killing somebody we don't like. But, protection against terror has never been a high priority for the U.S. or other governments. It's easy to show. So there's bipartisan agreement, that's true. And it'll probably continue, as I'm sure you all know, especially those of you in criminal justice. It's expanding domestically to domestic surveillance, to going after people you don't like here, probably on the same conditions, especially under Obama. Huge increase in domestic surveillance, tearing to shreds American civil liberties. But there's bipartisan agreement. It's only harming the mass of the population, like the focus on the deficit, but that's minor significance. So yes, it can be stopped, but it's going to have to be mass popular action, like what finally happened in the Vietnam War. Actually, one of the most interesting parts of the Pentagon Papers, which is never commented on, it's, again, too interesting, is their very last part. Very end of it ends. The Pentagon Papers ends in mid 1968. In January 1968, there was an incredible uprising in South Vietnam. It's called the Tet Offensive. It wasn't an offensive. It was just a massive uprising all over the country. It was pretty astonishing because the whole country was penetrated with spies, soldiers, everything, and nobody knew anything about it. It was kept secret. And it suddenly burst out, and the U.S. could barely control it. It's never described that way, of course, but that's what it was. That was of great concern here because it showed that it's not going to be easy to gain a military victory. We've got an opposition in the country which is so deeply rooted, it's going to be hard. Johnson was then president, and he wanted to send a couple 100,000 more troops to Vietnam. But the Joint Chiefs were opposed to it, because they said that the troops are going to be needed for civil disorder control in the United States. If we send them, there's going to be an uprising in the United States among young people, women, others, and we're just going to need troops to control them. So they didn't want to send the troops. And that's a good indication of the impact that the anti-war movement was having. Didn't end the war, but it constrained it. Meant there were things they could have done that they didn't do. So it can have effects, and drones also, if there's a big popular movement.
How's it going, Professor? For all the folks in the audience who are trying to just get their hands on some more truth, what would you give them advice-wise in regards to continuous pressures from the government with censorship that come along with, the Stop Online Piracy Act, as well as other legislative proposals?
Always the same advice. There's no secrets. There's been a lot of progress over the last couple centuries, even the last generation. Always works the same way. It comes from the pressure of organized popular movements. If they reach enough scale, so-called leaders emerge, and sometimes it reaches legislation, and some changes are introduced, and if you keep it up, you can keep going. Everything, just take the last generation. There have been improvements in the women's movement, the environmental movement, the anti-war movement, something about civil and minority rights, not enough, but some. Everything you look at, it's the same. That's the way it worked. And if there's another way, it's never been discovered. So I think that's about the only advice you can give.
Can I just add that as somebody who listened to that advice, I think the most important thing is never give up.
Yeah.
Because there are losses and there are backslidings, but you do see that there have been times in history where progress has been made, and so the point is not to give up, no matter how hard it looks.
That's right. If I can just add one word to that. Another thing we're not allowed to say, but so if you don't mind, I'll say it, is that that's one lesson that the old Communist Party knew. You take a look over many years, the Communist Party was almost always in the forefront of human rights activities, civil rights activities, opposition to war, and so on. And part of the reason was just what Michael said. They knew that. It's going to be a long struggle. We can't just quit after one try. And in fact, there always was somebody around who remembered how to turn the mimeograph machines and how to organize a demonstration and so on. In our society, the way it's a very kind of instant gratification society. If you don't get what you want quickly, you stop, and the next time you start, all the lessons have to be learned over again from scratch. That is not effective. I mean, it's made some achievements, but you really have to have staying power, just like Michael said.
Hi, Professor Chomsky. Thanks for speaking here tonight. I had one question under the theme of the decline of empire.
Get a little closer to the mic.
Sorry. One question under the theme of decline of empire, which is what prospects do you see now for integration of states among the global south, from Latin America to Africa and Southeast Asia? And how hopeful are you of states or politicians that are showing some signs of rejection towards U.S. hegemony?
Could you hear?
They got it.
Yeah, that's taking place, and it's quite interesting. So there are groupings forming of the global south. The best known one is what's called the BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, which have been working together. They've come out with policy proposals. Sometimes they achieve something. The West doesn't like them, of course. So, for example, in the bombing of Libya, take the bombing of Libya, interesting case. What's claimed is the international community supported the bombing of Libya. Okay, who's the international community? Well, it turns out to be the United States and anyone who happens to agree with it at that moment, and not the world. If you look at the bombing of Libya, it was the three traditional imperial powers, France, Britain, and the United States. Almost nobody else. I mean, Libya's in the BRICS countries happened to be meeting at that time in China somewhere. And they came out with a strong statement calling for ceasefire, negotiations, attempt at a political settlement which would head off the likely humanitarian crisis, which in fact took place. They weren't alone. The African Union took exactly the same position. It's an African country. The non-aligned movement, which is most of the world, took that position. Germany wouldn't go along, even in NATO. Turkey, at the beginning, joined the rest of the world. They finally shifted over to the imperial camp when they saw it was happening anyway. But the BRICS had a position, and it's true in other cases too. And they can do some things. You know, it's a growing force, and it's not the only one. As I said, Latin America is moving towards integration for the first time. There was a very striking development in about a year ago. There was a hemispheric conference in Colombia, Cartagena, Colombia, conference of the whole hemisphere. And there were two issues that came up. They could never come out with a statement because there was no consensus on the two issues. One issue was allowing Cuba in. The other issue was moving towards decriminalizing drugs. And there were two holdouts on both issues, Canada and the United States. They're almost out of the hemisphere by now. If there's another meeting, I suspect they'll be excluded. In fact, there already is, in form, an organization, CELAC it's called, which was formed in Venezuela, which includes every country of the hemisphere except the United States and Canada. And if that becomes more than a forum, it could be meaningful. Within South America itself, there's a couple of integrated systems that have developed. One is UNASUR, the Union of South American Republics, I guess, which has already taken some positions. So like they supported Bolivia when it was under attack by US-backed right-wing elites. Remember, Latin America, the traditional setup in Latin America is a lot of resources, a lot of potential wealth, but horrible misery. They're mostly run by small elites, Europeanized, often white. They kind of run the place. And their orientation is towards the West. They don't care about their countries. And that's what happened in Bolivia. The old white elite tried to overthrow the government. The U.S. was backing it, of course. UNASUR moved in right away, supported the president, Morales, and that saved it. Those are things that are beginning to happen. I think you're going to see more and more of them.
Thank you.
We are going to have one more question over here. I do apologize, but Professor Chomsky got on a plane in Boston this morning at 2:30 just to come to John Jay, and he's got a plane to catch to get back to Boston tonight. So one more question. Go for it.
A lot of pressure. I'll try and ask one that spans the 50, 60 years that you've been talking about. When you were talking in the 50s, when you were talking in the 60s, you made the linkage on the concept of the domino theory and tied it to state models, viruses, and such. When I was growing up during that period, much more of the comment about the domino theory was meddling. The communists are going to meddle. They're going to put their people in place in the various countries, whether it was Laos, Cambodia, and such. Just wondered whether that was in fact going on. I mean, at the same point where we were trying, the U.S. was trying to put our puppets in a variety of places, whether it was South America or Southeast Asia. I was wondering whether Russia and or Communist China were trying to do the same at the time and bring it forward sort of full tilt. Where do you see, or do you see those three regimes actually doing the old-fashioned covert meddling to sort of put their people in power now? So maybe you can sort of cover that broadly. So,
did you get that? The idea was that is it possible that as people were talking about the domino theory, that maybe there was some meddling, meddling, by China and the Soviet Union in certain countries to try to make them friends? And is it possible that the new Russia, the new China, as well as the United States, might be doing some meddling with other countries today?
Well, China has not been an imperial power, really. Maybe that'll happen in the future, But if you look at all of Chinese history, it's never really happened. Thousands of years. They had tributaries. So, a lot of the region was dominated by China. I mentioned Okinawa, but a lot of countries paid tribute to China, the center of the world. The barbarians paid tribute. But it hasn't really been an imperial power in the European sense. And it isn't now either. Of course, it's meddling all over the place, but in its own way. Like take Libya again, which I mentioned. China had a lot of investments in Libya. They had tens of thousands of Chinese technicians there trying to develop Libyan oil supplies. They had to flee when the bombing started, and I suspect that one of the reasons for the bombing was to get the Chinese out. And they're not nice guys. Like when they move into Africa, they're just as exploitative and harsh as anyone else. But it's not military. Russia... Let's go back to Russia. That's a more interesting case because at the end of the Second World War, there was a settlement. Russia took over Eastern Europe, right, up to East Germany, and the U.S. essentially took over the rest. And if you look at the actual events of the Cold War, not the rhetoric, You pretty well capture the events of the Cold War by observing that it was a kind of a tacit compact between the two superpowers, not to attack each other. That was too dangerous. Happened once, the missile crisis, but basically leave each other alone, and each one will be free to intervene in its own domains. For Russia, Eastern Europe, for the United States, most of the rest of the world. Those are the events of the Cold War, and that's what it's about. There's an asymmetry, of course, and the asymmetry had to do with the relative power of Russia and the United States. Russia's much weaker. There's another asymmetry. For Eastern, this is not the, Russia was pretty harsh in Eastern Europe. You know, the Hungarian Revolution was brutally suppressed, the Czech independence, and so on. On the other hand, Russia had a real concern. This is the invasion route through which Russia had almost been destroyed 3 times in the century, right? The United States has never been invaded through Central America. It was quite asymmetrical. Another asymmetry is that in order to keep Eastern Europe under control, Russia basically subsidized it. It was actually been pointed out, I think by the CIA or somebody, that Russia is a unique empire in history in that its colonies were richer than it was. So the Eastern European countries were actually better off than Russia. Not because they're nice guys, but they wanted to make sure that this region was under control. It's a very sensitive region for them. So yes, they meddled there. You could say they meddled elsewhere. So for example, when the US was bombing North Vietnam, Russia gave defensive weapons to the Russians, to Hanoi, to anti-aircraft weapons, for example, which did shoot down American bombers bombing North Vietnam. That's the moral problem that George Bush was talking about. In the case of Cuba, after the U.S. invaded, Bay of Pigs, terror, and so on, the Russians provided substantial support to Cuba up until the collapse of the Soviet Union. And it's interesting the way the U.S. reacted after that collapse. The U.S. reacted by immediately escalating the attack on Cuba. No more Russians, right? They're pulling out. So what do? We have harsher sanctions. They were introduced by the Democrats, incidentally. George Bush, the president, was going to veto them, but he was outflanked from the right by Bill Clinton, what's his name? Torricelli, I think, the New Jersey senator, Democrat. They wanted harsher sanctions because now we got them by the throat. Let's strangle them. But they somehow survived. And other things like that. And, you could say the U.S. meddled in Eastern Europe. Not much, like didn't sponsor revolutions, but it spread propaganda, tried to support uprisings and things, so there's something like that. But the real meddling, and it's an understatement, is within their own domains. And that was a real horror story. Actually, it was worse in U.S. domains than in Eastern Europe, at least after Stalin's death.
Thank you.
Thank you. How you doing? You okay?
Yeah, I'm okay.
Thank you.